Kozuki Naoto took a long pull from the unlabeled bottle in his hand, and winced at the liquid fire running down the back of his throat. His eyes watered from the pain and the fumes, but his long experience made ignoring the burn trivial. Wish everything else was that easy to tune out. He carefully wiped the mouth of the bottle off on his sleeve and handed to his best friend, Kaname Ogi. Both men were squatting on their haunches on the roof of their crumbling apartment building, cigarette in one hand and passing one of the many bottles of homebrew liquor their little band of terrorists had acquired earlier that night back and forth with the other. Naoto had known Ogi for years, ever since their first year of senior high school, and he'd always known the other man to be a sober, dependably straight-laced individual, given to introspection and quiet humor. Which would have made the long slug Ogi took from the bottle disturbing to Naoto almost any other night. Such an uninhibited and downright greedy chug of hard liquor straight from the bottle would normally indicate some sort of deep concern or anxiety on his friend's part, and ordinarily Naoto would have done his best to suss out what was troubling his best friend. Not tonight. He knew exactly what was troubling Ogi. Naoto shuddered as he remembered what he'd seen, and took a long drag from the roll-up. Yes, he knew what was bothering Ogi, and he wouldn't begrudge him a single drop of liquid comfort tonight. About 5 hours after he and Tanya, their newest, most disturbing recruit, had left to scout out the possible stash house, Ogi had burst through the door of their sub-basement hideout, startling Naoto and Tamaki to instant wakefulness from their snoozing on the couches. As quickly as he could, Ogi had briefed the two of them about the night's events, from their unproductive stakeout to Tanya's sudden return to their observation point an hour after she'd left on a 15-minute walk, dripping with blood and utterly nonchalant. He'd concluded by saying he'd left Tanya outside guarding a truck full of unknown goods, a truck that she had brutally slain 2 men to hijack. Naoto had been, to say the least, very confused. Tanya and Ogi had left on a simple scouting and information-gathering mission, but apparently the mission had rapidly evolved while they'd been out. Ogi had grabbed a pair of bolt cutters and led him and Tamaki out to the rubble-strewn parking lot of the ruined apartment block they hid under, and sure enough, a battered truck was waiting for them. Beside that truck. Naoto shuddered again at the memory, and gestured at Ogi to hand the bottle back. His friend wiped the bottle clean and duly obliged, and Naoto took another hit from the horrible moonshine. He knew he'd regret it come the morning, but he wanted the memory of the tiny figure softened into a comfortable blur as quickly as possible. Tanya had stood beside the truck, practically swimming in an oversized black sweatshirt and a battered and cut-down pair of men's work pants. The scarf she'd wrapped around her head to conceal her sunny blonde hair had loosened during her busy night, and a thick lock of hair hung freely over her eyes, as if to emphasize her youth. Below that errant lock were a wide smile of satisfaction, pride at a job well and skillfully done clear in every line of her face, and a pair of haunting blue eyes. Naoto had seen lots of empty-eyed gazes after the conquest, people broken from shock and trauma, hollowed out inside and mere shells of the passionate men and women and children they'd once been. Tanya's eyes were not hollow, nor empty, nor flat. Instead, there was a sort of mixture of childish and adult characteristics he found very hard to pin down, as if those eyes were some sort of estuary between the innocent, bright emotions of a child and the ancient wisdom of someone who had lived too long and seen too much. Naoto drank, and counted himself lucky he had never seen a pair of eyes like that before. He knew that he came from a position of rare privilege for a Japanese man in this Britannian-dominated world, the bastard son of one of the few nobles who was a legitimately good man, who loved his children and cared for their mother despite her current state. Even before Lord Stadtfeld had welcomed his daughter and her mother back into the fold by adopting the former as his legitimate heir and employing the latter as his maid, his father had sent enough money to let them live in one of the lower rent areas of the Britannian concession, designated for common Britannians. True, Naoto had had to fist-fight virtually every young or middle-aged Brit man in the neighborhood, and some of the women, to live there without trouble, and he'd had to fight whole gangs of Brits who tried to attack his little sister on 2 notable occasions, but he was still very aware that he'd been lucky. He'd never had to live in the ghetto. He'd come here by choice, reconnecting with his college friends, meeting Ogi's former co-workers, and bringing weapons and ammunition purchased in the Britannian homeland along with his eager desire to see Britannia brought down. His first month in the ghetto had been an education, to say the least. He knew, of course, about the broad strokes of the Britannian occupation, of the brutal policies of the area administration, but he hadn't known, not on the level that only first-hand experience could teach. And even then, he'd still been lucky. He had come to the ghetto as a man, young and strong, with a gun at his belt and thick muscles on his body. He hadn't been forced into the ghetto as a child, marked out as different and alien by her hair and eyes, forced to work long hours for years to keep herself fed, and hadn't grown up with the humiliations and violations of the occupation a daily reality. He thanked his lucky stars, his father, and any gods who existed that he hadn't lived like that every time he saw Tanya. She'd been literally dripping with blood, her arms up to the shoulder wet with the stuff, and clearly exhausted, but Tanya still smiled. Her frail body, sharp cheekbones and too thin arms, trembled with exhaustion, but she'd still been energetic enough to offer to help carry the multitude of heavy boxes from the truck down the 2 flights of stairs to the basement. Still groggy with sleep, Naoto hadn't been able to say a word to the vision of murdered innocence before him, but Ogi, with a surprisingly gentle voice after his near panic in the basement, had gratefully but firmly turned down her kind offer. He'd said she'd done enough that night, that he hadn't done his fair share of the work on their mission, so she could take a break while they carried the spoils down into the basement. Apparently, Ogi's instincts as a teacher had served him well, as she'd accepted this line of logic and stood aside as they carried box after box down to the hideout. After they'd unloaded the truck, Ogi had volunteered to dispose of it, taking 2 grenades with him and advising Naoto to keep a careful eye on Tanya. He'd followed his friend's advice as he and Ogi opened the various boxes, noting the girl's reaction out of the corner of his eye to see what she thought of the spoils of war. She'd been ambivalent towards the moonshine, interested in the lab equipment and materials, calculating when Tamaki had identified the meth, and at first very interested and then dismissive of the rifles. Naoto hadn't been surprised by the first and last reactions, considering how new firearms generally didn't come with ammunition to make them a complete weapon system, but her interest in the lab equipment caught him by surprise. As far as he knew, she was an essentially uneducated street urchin. He didn't know if she even knew what the various flasks and beakers were for, but something about them had clearly caught her interest. Her immediate question, "Naoto, how do you feel about selling amphetamines to the Britannians?" had come as a shock. He'd already abandoned any attempt to try and predict what fresh, brilliant insanity would emerge from Tanya's mouth, but her suggestion of trying to hook their overlords on hard drugs was inspired and unexpected, as most of her suggestions were. He'd fobbed her off by saying he'd have to think about it, and she'd nodded and muttered something about logistics to his great relief. Naoto was determined to free Japan from the leprous hand of Britannia, but he didn't know if he could endorse selling hard drugs to their enemies for that cause. Setting aside questions of efficacy, smuggling amphetamines into the concession was no small task, nor was finding buyers or figuring out how to convert their looted supply into a more permanent operation. Naoto was having a hard time convincing himself that the world would be a better place for their actions if they stooped to that level. As far as he was concerned, all 45 kilograms of crystal could catch fire, and he'd be happy. Of course, he hadn't shared these thoughts with Tanya, and thankfully she hadn't asked. Instead, she'd simply made her way over to the couches, lay down in an uncharacteristically casual display, and immediately fallen asleep. Tamaki and he had quietly laughed to each other about the lion sleeping off a meal, but he'd known Tamaki long enough to hear the hollow joy for what it was. They'd continued to work in as much quiet as possible, finding places to store their new rifles, the box of cash, and the lab equipment in the armory/storage area of the hideout. 2 hours later, Ogi had returned from his errand. He'd apparently driven the truck west, towards the edge of the Shinjuku ghetto and Nakano, before parking it on a sufficiently abandoned street, rolling the 2 grenades under the cab, and running like hell. He'd looked back to see the truck on its side and smoking, and had kept running for another mile before walking the rest of the way back to Shinjuku and the hideout. Naoto vaguely hoped that nobody had been hurt by the grenade's shrapnel, but he was just honestly glad to have seen the last of that blood-drenched truck cab. He couldn't imagine how awful it must have been for Ogi, perched awkwardly on a seat practically saturated with drying blood, doing his best to ignore the scent of shit that had lingered even after the corpses Tanya had produced had been dumped unceremoniously in an alley. Wordlessly, Naoto passed the bottle back to Ogi. He'd forgotten to wipe the bottle off this time, but his friend apparently didn't care. Tanya was still asleep when they decided to call it a night, and neither he nor Ogi had the heart to wake her up. When she slept, she looked so different, so innocent and vulnerable. When awake, Tanya was an enthusiastic ball of energy and suggestions one moment, a haunting vision of the human cost of war in another, a paranoid and twitchy ball of nerves in a third, and a terrifyingly efficient fighting machine in the next. But asleep, she just looked like a kid, and a good one at that. Her face relaxed into a peaceful smile, which almost made you overlook the hollows of her cheeks and how each bone in her hand stood out against the skin. Naoto was happy to see that the hollows were a bit less deep than when Ogi had first brought her back to their apartment, but she still looked so fragile. After waiting a bit to see if she'd wake back up, they'd had a short discussion, and they decided it would be bad if she woke up alone in a strange place after such a violent and potentially traumatic experience. Ogi had carefully scooped the girl up and begun carrying her up the stairs. She'd sleepily protested for a moment, before drifting back off again. She hadn't woken back up during the long walk back home, even after being passed back and forth 3 times, and hadn't woken when they'd put her down in the nest of blankets she'd assembled in the corner of their studio, head on the single ratty pillow Ogi had managed to barter from Mrs. Maki 2 doors down. Tanya still wore her mission clothes, now crusted with dried blood. But neither man had wanted to try washing or changing her, so they'd simply left her on her nest of blankets before heading up to the roof to try and drink away the stress of another night in Shinjuku. Ogi put the bottle down on the roof between them, and turned towards Naoto. Shit, here it comes. Naoto had hoped they could just drink themselves silly in silence, but he'd know this was coming. There's something very wrong with that girl, Naoto. The former teacher's voice was quiet but firm in the morning light, and Naoto groaned aloud. What else is new? Naoto sighed and took another drag on the coffin nail. We've already been over this, Ogi. You're right, she's all kinds of fucked up. I'm not disagreeing with you here. He ground the stub of the roll-up out on the roof, and flicked the butt away. Problem is, you and I both know she's way too dangerous to let wander around on her own. When we took her in, we took responsibility for her, and that means we can't just kick her out because she's... how the hell do I sum up Hajime Tanya in a single adjective? Because she's her. Naoto finished lamely, blaming drinking moonshine on an empty stomach for the sudden lack of eloquence. I know that, damn it. Ogi's voice lacked anger, but was full of pent-up frustration and shame. I know that it's not her fault she is the way she is. It's not her fault she's so scary I almost piss myself every time she looks at me. I know, goddammit, but Naoto. We can't let her just. Naoto suddenly felt much older than his 26, almost 27 years. She saved Callan's life, Ogi. I can't ignore that. Who knows what the hell would have happened to her, if Tanya hadn't been armed and found her in time. He shivered, and thrust the horrible images his mind produced away as hard as he could. Plus, she's finally managed to get Tamaki to stop goofing around for 5 minutes and take things seriously. She's still a child soldier, Naoto. I can't ignore that. Ogi looked up, away from Naoto and into the sky. I know she saved your sister. I know she's an absolutely terrifying fighter. I know she even slapped some sense into Tamaki. He looked back down, and met Naoto's eyes again. She's still a child, and children shouldn't be sent into war. I'm sorry, but it's wrong. She's 11, Naoto. 11. Ogi took a deep breath, and looked away again, trying to calm down. Naoto took a deep breath too, and tried his best to keep his cool. I don't like it any more than you do, Ogi. But, what do you think I should do? Naoto shook his head with irritation, his words sounding weak even to him. I mean, we've tried to get her to act more her age. We've tried to keep her out of harm's way. It hasn't really been working out so far, has it, Ogi? After Ogi had first brought Tanya back to their apartment after she'd been kicked out of her deceased mother's apartment, she'd immediately begun acting paranoid. She'd almost attacked Naoto when he'd first arrived for no reason he could determine, and when Ogi had tried to feed her, despite their assurances that she could eat as much as she wanted, she'd barely taken a few bites. After that rocky start, she'd taken to disappearing during most of the daylight hours, saying something about earning her keep, and none of Ogi's attempts to convince her that she was welcome to their food seemed to sink in. Naoto had been convinced by Tanya's passionate argument to bring her into the cell, unable to argue with her point that she was old enough to be put up against a wall and shot and thus old enough to try and fight back. He'd intended for her to help out in a non-combat role, Perhaps helping secure supplies, or helping apply basic first aid and running messages. Essentially, Naoto had figured that she could be given some necessary but not dangerous tasks, and could be the mascot and morale officer for the fledgling guerrilla organization. That idea hadn't survived the near disaster of Tanya's first meeting with the other members of the cell, when Tamaki had flown off the handle and pulled a gun on the girl. Worse yet, Naoto and Ogi had been completely helpless, unable to de-escalate the situation and too far from Tamaki to take the gun away from him before he could pull the trigger. To their mixed thankfulness and horror, their intervention had proven unnecessary, as the half-blooded waif they'd inadvertently put in a near-death situation had first forced Tamaki into submission and then taken away his gun without any discernible effort. It was an outright miracle that things had ended without at least one death, but her abilities had been as frighteningly mysterious as they'd been baffling. Ogi had succumbed to guilt within a week after the disastrous meeting, unable to withstand both his own shame at almost getting a child killed by an unpredictable and violent friend of his and the brutally effective guilt trip the child in question had deployed. Very much against his better judgment, Ogi had armed Tanya with a standard Britannian sidearm and taken time out of his days to walk with her to the hideout so she could practice with it once she demonstrated her clear proficiency with the damned thing. Each time they'd returned from the hideout, Ogi had come up to the roof, beer in hand, and talked endlessly about how horribly unnatural it was to see a school-aged child coolly and professionally servicing targets with her pistol, never missing the bullseye. Within a week, she'd been a better shot than any other member of the cell, at least when it came to paper targets. Tanya had proven that she could shoot at other targets without qualm soon after, when she'd saved his baby sister's life. Naoto had been 12 when Callan was born, and after their father had left Japan to return to the homeland after the conquest, he'd taken over many parental duties as their mother increasingly fell to pieces. Callan's private description of the encounter had been somewhat vague, and lacked many of the specific details Tanya had included in her verbal report, but his sister had clearly remembered how calm and unemotional Tanya had been after the fight and during the process of hiding the bodies in an alley. The image of his sister hauling bodies made Naoto sick to his stomach, and the idea of a girl 4 years her junior helping her with the other end of the corpses made it even worse. He took heart from the details that Callan had shared about their conversation afterwards, including Tanya's dream of going back to school, and that she tried to make Callan feel better when his sister had begun to feel the full impact of taking a human life. But the whole incident still made him sick with worry and grief. "You're right." Ogi bitterly sighed out the admission. "We can't keep her from fighting. She's made that abundantly clear yesterday and tonight." The former teacher cocked his head, and looked quizzically at Naoto. "Do you realize that she nearly usurped leadership of the cell from you yesterday? In 10 minutes, she totally reoriented our cell's strategic focus for the foreseeable future, and gave everybody there a stake in the idea she's selling." Naoto grimaced. "Of course I realize that. And yes, it does feel galling to have an 11-year-old prove she's a far better planner than you are." He took a moment and ruthlessly squashed the rising sense of irritation down again. "I'm not proud enough to hold on to a bad plan just because I made it, Ogi. If she's got good ideas, I'm going to use them. I'd have to be completely stupid to just make her shut up, and I don't think she would if I tried to order her to do so." He groaned and rubbed at his forehead at the memory of Tanya, bright-eyed and enthusiastic, cheerfully burbling out all the various short and long-term benefits of her new grand plan. In that moment, she'd reminded him so much of a much younger Callan from before the conquest, showing off a picture she'd drawn to their mother. Ogi patted him on the back sympathetically. "That's the hell of it, isn't it?" Ogi said philosophically. "She's so good at everything she's tried so far, and so determined to fight the good fight that it would be practically criminal not to use her. But she's still a child soldier, and sending a child to war is evil, Naoto. It's evil, and we both know it's evil." Ogi picked the bottle back up and took another swig. "Tanya is a better shot than I am, and I bet she's a better killer too. I mean, before she came, our cell had maybe 3 deaths on its hands, right?" "4, corrected Naoto. "After that guy saw Tamaki trying to break into that warehouse. I heard in the news he actually died in the hospital a few hours after we legged it." Ogi nodded. "4 then. And that's in 3 months of operations. Tanya has killed at least 5 people that we know of in just the last week." Both men fell silent for a moment at the implication before Ogi continued more softly. "I know she's an asset, but she's just a kid. I don't want to have to bury her someday. I understand her point about being old enough to die, but, well, what are we fighting for, if not to stop having kids get shot at all? Naoto shrugged. He was tired and drunk, and it was hard to be particularly philosophical. I just know that she saved Callan's life, Ogi. I don't like letting her fight any more than you do, but I'm not going to try to make her stop now. She's earned the right to stand with us, even if it does leave a bad taste in my mouth. Naoto smiled and chuckled to himself. At least they each made a friend, judging by the way Callan was talking about Tanya. It's good to hear her being so happy and enthusiastic after. Ogi wordlessly passed the bottle back, and Naoto drank. Plus, she's finally stopped badgering me to let her go on missions with us. Ogi let out a bark of laughter at that. You don't seriously think that's going to last, do you? Naoto laughed too, before sighing wistfully. Well, no, but I'm glad that Tanya gave her something else to focus on instead. A minute of silence passed, until Naoto stood from his squat and began to walk around the roof, trying to get the blood to flow back into his legs. After a moment, Ogi stood up and joined him. Naoto, what are we going to do? She's literally got blood on her hands at this very moment, and you can't think that's the last of it. Are we really going to use a little girl as a soldier in our war-free Japan? Naoto sighed, and turned back to his best friend. Yes, Ogi, yes we are. I don't think we have much of a choice in the matter. We're not going to convince her to stop fighting, and we're not exactly swimming in highly skilled recruits to replace her with. Naoto felt shame at the admission wash over him, and had a hard time maintaining eye contact with Ogi. I suppose this is part of the sacrifice she talked about, isn't it? Whether we could put the good of all over personal desires and all that? Neither of us want her to fight, but she's clearly dedicated to the cause. Ogi grimaced again, and Naoto saw the same guilt and horror in Ogi's expression that he was sure his friend saw on his. You're right, she's going to fight no matter what we say or do. Last night she basically just abandoned me for an hour, and came back asking if I could drive a truck. She was just covered in blood, but didn't appear to notice or care. And this time, she'd killed those poor bastards with a knife, not even with her gun. He shivered, and continued. I've already been having nightmares about her, you know. This isn't going to help them. I don't even know if I'm afraid of her, or just what she represents. Naoto nodded in understanding. Tanya's definitely a loose cannon. I think she just tolerates any orders I give to her, but, well, at least she's humoring me so far and being a good girl. And I get it, I think. She's been a victim for years since the conquest, right? Based on what she's seen some really fucked up stuff, and she couldn't do anything about it. And now, she's finally got the opportunity to do something, to be the one hurting other people rather than being hurt. Ogi agreed. Yeah, that definitely sounds right. It sounds exactly like why kids bully each other. They feel weak and powerless, and they want to fix that by proving they aren't. Ogi sighed, and idly kicked at the roof. But to her credit, she could be targeting other Japanese if she wanted that. I'm glad she's decided to target the people actually responsible for what she's endured. You know, I always wanted to work as a teacher. I enjoyed working with kids, and it felt great to see them understand what I was explaining to them. It felt like I was helping to build a better world, you know? Naoto nodded silently, remembering how enthusiastic Ogi had been when he'd graduated from university and become an assistant math teacher at a junior high school. It's been really hard to even help tutor little Kyoko and little Takahiro since she showed up. I keep wondering if when I look up from the textbook, if they'll have the same eyes as Danya. I've never been scared of kids before, Naoto, but I keep getting twitchy just being around them now. Naoto clapped his friend on the back companionably. Come on, snap out of it, Ogi. You're getting too far into your head about this. Kyoko and Takahiro have both their parents, enough food, and are both full Japanese. They're nothing like Danya. Ogi sighed and hung his head. I know, it's just. Tanya doesn't even look or act like Danya sometimes, you know? Like when Tamaki was showing her how the pistol worked, she looked just like one of my favorite students from back then. Same eager expression, same thirst for knowledge. Only Chihiro thought geometry was really cool, while Tanya fell in love with a damned weapon. It just makes me wonder how many other kids are going to pick up a gun too before this is over, you know? Tanya is one thing, But what if something happens to Mrs. Maki, and Takahiro asks to join us because he wants revenge? How many children is too much of a sacrifice for a free Japan, Naoto? Naoto found to his shame that he couldn't immediately answer the question, and wondered himself what the end of the war, if it ever came, would look like. Callan quietly sat in her third-period algebra class, dutifully taking notes on polynomial functions from the second row. Unlike her usual behavior at the start of the year, she no longer sat in the back of the classroom, and no longer hunched down over her papers, trying to be as invisible as possible. Instead, she sat with her back straight and shoulders back, posture as picture-perfect as any etiquette instructor might hope to see. The changes in her school life didn't stop with a new seat and a straight back, though. The day after her encounter in the slums, she had informed the Ashford Academy administration that she was feeling much better, and her doctor was enthusiastic about her condition, meaning she wouldn't be missing as much school as they'd feared. She still hated the shallow, self-absorbed noble brats that surrounded her, but Callan's whole understanding of her hatred had radically shifted overnight. Instead of being a reason to avoid the inbred bastards and to skip out on school as often as possible, her hatred was her burden to carry. Being pleasant and sociable with those she held in contempt was the sacrifice she was making for Japan. It wasn't a particularly weighty sacrifice, Callan knew, not compared to the men and women dying in the ghetto as our teacher droned on and on, but it was one that she was uniquely placed to make. Callan wouldn't let an opportunity to strike a blow against the hated Britannians slip past her. Pointing out the amount of damage she could do to the rich bastards who bought and sold her people's future was the second great gift her newest and only friend had given her, the first being her continued existence. Tanya had been there when Callan had needed her, both when she was against that wall and when the image of a gaping mouth with a throat full of blood, desperate eyes bugging out as he tried to breathe through a ruined windpipe had become too much to bear. Instead of mocking her weakness, Tanya had reassured her, told her that she was strong, and had revealed her own personal trauma and weakness to set them back on equal footing. And Tanya had given her a purpose, a way to fight back that her brother wouldn't hold her back from. Ever since that day in Shinjuku, Callan had begun to integrate herself into the school's social scene, joining a conversation here or there, agreeing to a minor social engagement now and then. A tea party on Thursday, tennis on Saturday, and so on and so forth. Her earlier unsociable behavior was quickly excused as the result of her never-specified illness, and she'd effortlessly slipped into a role as an outer member in several cliques and groups, rarely finding herself alone at the academy. Callan generally said little, only offering expressions of interest in the latest gossip and goings-on and ruthlessly keeping her seething anger and contempt hidden. Callan had begun to memorize any gossip she heard in the halls, and would write it down into her class notes as the lectures rambled on. After school, she'd review her notes and copy the gossip items out into a special notebook she'd begun to compile. She hadn't heard anything particularly useful yet. No troop movements or schemes to start harvesting the organs of Japanese prisoners had been bandied about in her hearing, not yet, but she had begun to create profiles of her classmates, adding details about their backgrounds and social connections from the gossip she collected. Slowly, Callan had begun to understand the complex social network that spanned the student body, and the many ties major and minor between the disparate members. At first she had focused her information-gathering efforts on the obvious targets, children of titled nobility, ranking military and government officials, and of important corporate figures, but gradually she'd begun to focus instead on the people that they talked to, their friends and acquaintances, the second tier of the social hierarchy. These students, Callan had reasoned, would be less invested in hiding whatever secrets they had learned from or about their social superiors, and so would be more likely to spill the beans. The algebra class finally came to a merciful end, and Callan efficiently packed away her school things, making sure to keep her ears open as the class's forced silence exploded in a pent-up burst of conversation and chatter. Callan didn't linger too long, not wanting her eavesdropping to be too obvious, and slowly made her way out of the classroom, joining the ebb and flow of students in the sumptuous halls of Ashford Academy. The place was richly decorated to the point of rococo gaudiness, but Callan ignored the furnishings, even as she raged internally at the resources invested in gilding a loan that could have been used to feed her people. As a daughter and heir of a noble house, however minor, Callan was expected to be accustomed to the omnipresent decadent luxury surrounding her, and so she sank into her role. As she made her way through the hallway, Callan let a light smile touch her face, making a point to meet the eyes of everybody she could, doing her best to look as approachable as possible. She responded to the greetings of a knot of girls here, a handsome boy there, smiling and listening to what each had to say, complimenting each on their insight and intelligence as she drifted towards her next class. Suddenly, an arm snaked around her shoulder and pulled her into a casual hug as an enthusiastic greeting was practically shouted into her ear. Callan practically jumped out of her skin at the shock at the sudden, unexpected touch, and her hand was halfway to the concealed knife in her uniform jacket pocket before she realized she wasn't under attack. Instead of the red blood staining an already filthy white t-shirt, blankly staring eyes looking into hers until Tanya kicked trash over them attack as she half expected, Callan found the broadly grinning face of Millie Ashford 3 inches from her own, and belatedly summoned her socialite smile as quickly as she could. Callan. It's so good to finally meet you in person. The granddaughter of the academy's principal and director had a broad, vulpine smile across her face, and her eyes glittered with enthusiasm and humor. I'm Millie, but you probably know that already, huh? Welcome to Ashford Academy. Oh, thank you. It's so good to finally meet you. Callan artlessly babbled back, doing her best to look as wide-eyed and innocent as possible. Cafe day was really fun. I wish I'd been feeling good enough to participate. Cafe Day had been the first of the infamous Millie events that periodically swept the school that Callan had witnessed. Millie had abruptly declared the cafeteria the Café Ashford and forced her puppets on the school council and whoever else had the misfortune to draw her attention to be the waitstaff and baristas at this cafe. Allegedly, the funds raised had been gone to an unspecified good cause, but based on everything Callan knew about the smirking blonde, she had her doubts about that. I'm happy to hear about your recovery, Lady Staffeldt. Somehow, Millie's smile grew even more impish. It'd be such a waste of a pretty young girl to be stuck at home in bed all day long. Callan shuddered internally at the lecherous glint in the older girl's eyes, but pressed on with her wide-eyed innocent tact. Absolutely. It's so good to finally feel like my old self again. Suddenly, Callan remembered that she hadn't told Millie about her illness or her alleged recovery. But, how did you know that I was on the road to recovery? The lecherous smile dissolved into a smirk of self-satisfaction as Millie beamed. My grandpa's the principal of the school, so I get to look through the records whenever I want. And let me tell you, there's some interesting reading hidden between all the boring parts. The blonde dropped an exaggerated wink as Callan's eyes widened at the revelation. Nobody in Ashford Academy has any secrets from me, not for long, at least. For a brief moment, Callan suddenly felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to overbalance and fall. Does she know about Naruto and the Resistance? Is that what she's saying? Her palm itched for her knife, but Callan smashed her spiking fear of discovery back down. If she knew I was a killer and a rebel, she wouldn't have confronted me about it by herself in the middle of a school. Callan reassured herself, she would have told the authorities, and I would have been arrested before I could run. Which brought up the interesting question about what secrets the blonde was alluding to, assuming she wasn't just bragging or fishing for information. The only way out is through. Callan thought, realizing that not showing any reaction or interest in such a statement would be a blatant sign that she had some sort of secret to hide. And if I can get in close with her, maybe I'll be able to get access to those records too. Audacity, more audacity, and always audacity, as the line goes. And so, instead of recoiling back from the smug Millie, Callan summoned up her bravery and pulled Millie closer, letting her own smile broaden and sharpen to match the other girl's expression. That so? Got any juicy morsels you'd like to share with me? Doing her best not to gag at her own actions, Callan leaned in closer, almost touching the other girl's nose with her own. Come on, you know you wanna. What's the point of having secrets if you don't tell anybody? For a moment, Millie Ashford looked absolutely poleaxed at the sudden reversal of the social momentum, but she quickly recovered her poise. She slid her arm down Callan's shoulder and happily hooked her arm around Callan's, and then half walked, half dragged the redhead down the hall, merrily and loudly talking about the myriad minor scandals and screw-ups that had occurred at the academy recently, taking care to blatantly point out anyone who was both involved in the latest gossip and unfortunate to be out in the hall at that moment. As they approached the location of Callan's next class, she tried to subtly escape the blonde's surprisingly tight hold on her arm without success. Just as Callan was about to give in to her impulse to force Millie to let go, The older girl turned on her heel and wrapped her in an overly fond farewell embrace, prattling on about how much she'd enjoyed speaking with Callan and what a great listener she was. To Callan's hidden rage, the blonde took the opportunity to let her hands roam up and down her back, and she only barely resisted the urge to forcibly shove the blonde against a wall and see how she liked being threatened with a knife and feeling the terror as the four men surrounded and her palms were so sweaty and the knife was trembling and oh god, where was Nato? And finally, Millie let go and bounced away, finding some fresh target to harass, and Callan took a moment to close her eyes and take a deep breath. Holding back her anger suddenly seemed like an impossible task to Callan, and she wanted nothing more than to flee this damned fancy piece of shit school and the scum who infested it. All for Japan, she thought, remembering Tanya's words as they sat together on some desolate street. I can endure this. It's all for the cause. Nothing's too big to sacrifice for a free Japan. As she entered her class, Callan imagined introducing Millie to another blue-eyed blonde, and smiled dreamily imagining the likely result of that meeting. Someday, Millie, everything you love will burn. I promise you, by the time we're done, this whole wretched building will be ash. I woke up feeling exhausted, never an ideal start to the day. Every muscle in my arms, shoulders, and chest felt strained, like I had tried repeatedly to lift an overly heavy object, and my eyes felt as if they'd been glued shut. I recognized the feeling from my long-ago days of suffering through the Imperial Aerial Mage training program, where each day we were compelled to exert our magical abilities to the very knife's edge of collapse, day after day. The feeling of complete mana depletion also reminded me of that insane zealot of an orb development researcher, Dr. Schukel. The anger at the memory of that man's crazed eyes and scorn for safety features proved adequate fuel to pry my eyes open in the desperate attempt to escape. You're safe, I tried to reassure myself. You're not in the testing division anymore. You're... Huh? I could be wrong, but I was fairly certain I'd fallen asleep on one of the couches in the basement hideout, an admittedly uncomfortable place to sleep but far better than many other places I'd slept. But, judging by the sunlight flooding through a grimy window above me, I wasn't in a sub-basement anymore. No. No, no, no. I remembered the last time I had gone to sleep and awoken elsewhere. Had I somehow died again in my sleep? Had I somehow been injured during the struggle and not noticed due to shock, or had artillery once again rained down and destroyed my world? Had being stolen my soul and forced it into yet another horrible situation just as my life in Shinjuku started to improve? Fortunately, as the sudden adrenaline rush of pure horror filled my limbs with new energy, I recognized the room as Naoto and Ogi's studio apartment, and indeed saw Naoto himself sitting at the table, munching on crackers. He had been staring off into space, no doubt weighing the options ahead for our group, but as I began to stir he blinked and looked over at me. Ah, Tanya. Good to see that you're finally up. I was beginning to wonder if you'd sleep all day. Naoto's usually genial charm was present, but in a much lesser degree, and none of his usual energy was evident in his voice. He sounded worn out and dry, and from across the room I could smell the pungent reek of cigarette smoke. How about you wash yourself and join me for a snack? I've got some things I'd like to go over with you. I looked down at myself, and winced. My hands and wrists were reddish-brown with blood from last night's mission, and I could feel the material of my sweatshirt tugging against my skin where the crusting dried blood had glued it to my forearm. Altogether, an unprofessional state to be seen in by a superior, particularly without the excuse of being at the front lines to mitigate the awkward situation. Idly, I wondered if this request for a sudden meeting with an undefined agenda was some sideways punishment for my slovenly behavior, but that seemed out of character for the slick managerial style of Kozuki Naoto's leadership. More likely he was giving me time to fully wake up before getting down to whichever brass tacks needed handling at the present, and had graciously suggested washing myself so I would have something to do as I shook off the cobwebs. I nodded and responded with a chipper absolutely, and sprang to my feet, or at least attempted to do so. My affirmation came out as more of a croak than a chirp, and I had to lean on the floor as I hauled myself up. I feel weak. What's happening to me? Instinctively, I ran through the usual equations for my enhancement package, but nothing happened. No familiar strength returned to my arms, and the absence of my typically enhanced reflexes was so unexpected I nearly tripped over my own feet as I made my unsteady way towards the kitchen sink. I overdid it last night, that's the only explanation. I thought as I pushed the footstool Ogi had brought home after my first week in the apartment in front of the sink. And then I didn't eat when I returned. I must be completely out of energy. I'd experienced something like this before, after the first time I had activated the Type 95 and had nearly died from the sudden and uncontrolled elevation gain. My initial reasoning for trying to throttle that cursed orb in the crib had been my near-death experience on the testing field, coupled with my near-total mana depletion after I'd managed to land safely back on Earth. Only the intervention of Being X himself, his alleged blessing, and his cat's Portugal had forced that damned orb into existence despite the funding cuts to the development project my report had prompted. Another example of that bastard thinking that social laws and values don't apply to him. He had the power, so he did what he wanted. My legs quivered as I mounted the stool, but I gritted my teeth and forced them to steady as I turned on the sink. Thankfully, the water was working today, and after only a few halting spurts the ice-cold water flowed freely from the tap. I wonder if the Holy Britannian Empire really was founded with his approval? They seem to have the same value system, after all. Do what you want, who cares what it costs everybody else? The cold water was like a balm to my increasingly itchy skin, and the dried blood sluiced away down the drain. The rough soap stung the myriad irritations and sores left on my hands after hours of exposure to rotting blood, but the sting helped me ground myself in the moment almost as much as the bone-deep chill of the water. All too soon, my hands were clean, leaving me with no further excuses to dawdle, and so I turned off the water, hopped down from the stool, and joined Naoto at the table. He looked rather uncomfortable, for some reason, and didn't seem eager to start our conversation. Instead of saying anything, he just pushed the sleeve of crackers over to my side of the table. Out of courtesy, I took one and nibbled politely at it. Like a switch had been thrown, my belly made itself known and suddenly I could only think about how hungry I was, and how I had missed breakfast. Worse still, my stomach growled so loudly I was certain it was audible to Naoto, who thankfully merely raised an eyebrow and gestured at the crackers. Thankful, I took another, and another, mindlessly eating until I suddenly realized that half the sleeve was gone, there were crumbs all down my front, and that my enhancements had begun to work once again. As I bit down into yet another cracker, Naoto chose that as his moment to speak up. Tanya, I want to start off by saying you've been a huge help. I'm glad Ogi found you and brought you here. I hope that you understand that we're all very impressed with what you've achieved these last few weeks. I nearly spewed crumbs across the table as his reserved tone sank in. I know this pattern. I was accustomed to sitting on the other side of the table, but I could recognize a disciplinary meeting when I was on the receiving end too. The vague compliments, the professional assurances. It's the softening up start of an HR meeting before the inevitable but. I tried to marshal a defense, but I couldn't think of what I'd done to require official counseling. Is this because I acted without orders last night, and left Ogi by himself? I had to take the initiative. I didn't have any means of communicating the evolving situation. But I'd like to know where you want to go from here, Naoto continued, and my train of thought ground to a screeching halt. As far as I can tell, he continued, seemingly unaware at how my panic sublimated into sudden confusion, you're a great shot, and you've got a real knack for seeing opportunities and taking them. Wait, he's praising me for leaving Ogi behind? That can't be right. But yesterday, you also showed you could throw together a good plan, and get people on board with your ideas. Well, that's a relief. He's noticing that I have other competencies beyond just fighting. I'd known that Naoto was a good leader, but I'd been concerned that his warmongering tendencies would blind him to everything outside raw combat potential. And my heart sank in my chest. The way he'd enunciated that and the significant pause following it boded ill. Ogi and I have been talking, and we're worried that your abilities in the field might be impacted by how underweight you are. No. This isn't a disciplinary hearing. I'm going to get a medical discharge. I began to muster a protest, flailing about for some way to convince him that I was fully capable despite my skin and bone appearance, but Naoto put up a hand, stopping my protest before it began. I'm not saying you're doing a bad job or you're weak or whatever. I know your circumstances. He put his hand down and smiled at me. I just want to point out that part of the haul you captured last night was a whole box of Britannian cash, so you can afford to buy plenty of food now from the black market. I had more or less forgotten about the money, as I had been certain it would be set aside for the operational needs of the cell. I hadn't realized that Naoto would let me use any of it for personal expenses. So, here's my suggestion, he continued. I want you to take on more of the background work, talking with Ino about supply questions, talking with Ogi and I about potential strategies and targets, and all that kind of big picture stuff. At the same time, you can take the opportunity to eat as much as you'd like, and maybe work out with Tamaki and Nagata. Build up your muscle a bit, you know? How does that sound? It sounded glorious. If I was reading this situation correctly, Naoto was offering me the managerial post I'd been dreaming of since I first joined this cell far earlier than I could have dreamed. If I started planning out operations with him and Ogi to fulfill his father's strategic objectives, or if I began to help Ino with expanding the cell's logistical base and reach, I'd be far too valuable to risk falling into enemy hands, and thus safe from frontline assignments. Plus, if I had enough money to buy my own food, I wouldn't need to work any more odd jobs to feed myself, so I would have enough time and energy to begin training this body back into something close to what I'd been like before a damned Republican shell had blown me back into being X's hands. In fact, it sounded too good to be true. Is this another test? I wondered, feeling unaccountably weary at the thought. Is he still doubting my commitment to the cause? Or is he seeing if I'm some kind of spy, who would jump at the idea of access to more information about what Lord Stadtfeld is planning? I was relieved I could, for once, easily discard my concerns. I'd given him no cause to doubt my reliability, and I'd proven my willingness to kill to further the cause of the cell. And the cell was currently far too small to justify inserting an agent to gather intelligence, so the whole idea that I was a planted spy would be laughable, especially considering the Britannian tendency of shooting any number that looked rebellious and only determining guilt after the fact. I still felt myself waffling, though. Nothing this good came without major strings attached, in my experience, and I couldn't help but try and figure out what those strings were before I agreed. After all, when I'd thought I'd been assigned to a training squad, I discovered that the training squad also were the guinea pigs for prototype orbs. When Command had picked up and implemented my rapid response mage battalion idea, I'd ended up stuck with the task of getting the whole concept to work. Even when I'd managed to knock Dacia out of the war in a month, my only reward had been deployment back to the Rhine front, where I'd "Where's my arm, where's my face" run out of luck. Naoto interrupted my trip down memory lane with a deliberate cough. Honestly, there's another way you could help the cell. If you gain a bit of weight, you'll look just like a Britannian. You're the only one of us who doesn't look obviously Japanese, but you're too skinny to pass as a Brit civilian right now. I don't know exactly what expression I made in response to that, but Naoto hastily began talking again, this time in a soothing tone, as if I'd pulled a gun on him. Look, I know you hate Britannians, but just think about it, Tanya. You'll be able to infiltrate the concession with ease. None of them would think a cute little girl is actually an agent of the resistance. Remember your idea about selling drugs to the Britannians? Having an agent who can pass as Britannian and who looks so harmless would make that whole plan far simpler. At the cute little girl line, my hands had begun to ball into fists, but I took in a deep breath, relaxed them, and thought about the whole idea rationally. While my memories being doled up for the propaganda bureau, with Vishu enthusiastically cooing over me, were humiliating, they'd already proven useful when convincing Ogi to give me a weapon. Ignoring the prickling in the corners of my eyes again as I started to cry again, damn it, why? I looked back up at Naoto, nodded, and smiled. I'm eager to help the cell in whichever way you think is best. I began, but Naoto interrupted me for the second time. No, that's not what I meant. He paused, seemingly going over his words, and began again. I think you have the best understanding of what you are capable of, and you are intelligent enough to understand what we are trying to do. Hell, you basically made Tamaki reconsider why he's fighting Britannia in about 3 sentences. I want you to tell me where you think you'll do the most good, and I'll put you there. I had when I'd insulted him. Wait, is he giving me the freedom to choose my own assignment? I had never had that kind of freedom before. In my corporate first life, I had been a cog in a machine, turning as I was directed to by those higher up. In my military second life, I had similarly been a small part of a far greater whole, my desires immaterial to the faraway staff officers deciding where I was to go and what I was to do based on their own understanding of vast and intricate strategic plans. The only time I'd been given any degree of freedom to execute my orders as I'd seen fit had been with the creation of the 203rd comma, but it had been made clear to me from the beginning that my handling of the task would be under constant review. But now, I had found myself employed by what I was coming to understand was essentially a startup operating in a hostile environment. That meant that there was no safety net in place, no appealing to higher authority or relying upon reserves of personnel or supplies, but that also meant that Naoto was free to operate his cell as he wished, as long as he carried out his backers' objectives. And so he decided to pass that freedom on to me. I swallowed hard, trying to force the uncomfortable lump in the back of my throat down, and scrubbed vaguely at my eyes. I had begun to wonder if I had developed an allergy to dust or something, because recently I just kept tearing up during seemingly every conversation, and it was because you were alone and hungry for so long that any kindness seems foreign, very inconvenient and quite annoying. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate your confidence in me. I was proud at how smoothly and professional that had come out, with only a minimum of the hoarse scratchiness of hay fever marring the delivery. I need to keep my cool. My mind whirled at the implications of what he was offering. I can't show too much enthusiasm or he'll doubt my ability to remain competent while self-directed. If you don't mind, I would like to speak with Ino and Ogi first, so I can get a better understanding of how the cell operates, before I commit to any specific project or role. Naoto smiled and nodded, the exhaustion I'd noticed stamped on his face seeming to fade into relief. Was he worried I'd be offended by a promotion? That didn't make any sense. It was a rare employee who was opposed to climbing the totem pole, and I was certain I'd clearly signaled my desire to advance in the organization. Perhaps he was concerned that I might immediately let my new freedom go to my head and start issuing demands. I could understand that. Some people always tried to take a mile for any inch given and felt no scruples about biting the hand that fed them. Fortunately, as an experienced corporate operator, I understood the importance of being loyal to patrons. He knew exactly the coin to buy my favor. I marveled at the savvy Naoto had just displayed. Certainly not an Alexander, perhaps more a Caesar on the rise. He's given me enough rope to hang myself, while also putting me deeply in his debt. He's giving me an opportunity to prove myself while keeping me firmly under his thumb. I had, of course, no ambitions of challenging Naoto for control of the group, as among other reasons I had no relationship to Lord Stadtfeld, but he didn't know that, and I could only admire the way he had dealt with a potential internal rival. Fine with me. Naoto pushed off the table and stood, and I hastily made to drop the crackers and stand up as well, only for him to wave me back down. No need. It's my mother's weekly day off today, and I'm meeting her for dinner. He walked towards the door, snagging his coat from the peg it hung by as went. Ogi will be back shortly, so he can take you over to the hideout if you want. Ina should be coming in tonight to update our inventory, so you'll have an opportunity to talk with her as well if you'd like. The implicit message was loud and clear. I wouldn't be allowed to sit on my laurels. Naoto had given me operational freedom, and he expected to see dividends quickly. Understood. I'll get right on that. I chirped a reply, smiling coolly to try and express both my pleasure at my new assignment and my professional capacity. Naoto frowned slightly at that for some reason, but shook his head and left rather than raise whatever concern he had. Must be late for his dinner meeting. As I waited for Ogi to show up, I sat and thought about what I could bring to the organization, and what the organization actually needed to further progress towards the goal, namely seizing de facto power over Area 11 by supporting Lord Stadtfeld's political goals with Naoto's armed force. Truthfully, we were a long way away from fulfilling that lofty ambition, or my lesser personal ambition of holding a well-compensated yet safe position in the Stadtfeld organization. As far as I knew, the total extent of the organization was 6 men and women in a bunker, 7 if you counted Callan, without any significant resources at our disposal to buy or bribe help. A humble beginning to be sure, but we also had the advantage of being internally united, without any factions trying to challenge Naoto for leadership, and we were independent of any larger organization, meaning we were free to pursue our own goals. And since every other armed group in Shinjuku is hostile towards us already, we had an absolute abundance of targets. Our challenges could be broadly broken down into three mutually reinforcing issues: lack of funding and supplies, lack of personnel, and lack of notoriety or public relations. Without expanding our resource base and establishing more revenue streams, we would be unable to supply, arm, and train new recruits, conduct missions outside of Shinjuku, or pay bribes for information or assistance. I could help with this by negotiating with potential suppliers for better rates, scouting Shinjuku for opportunities to raid other organizations for their assets, or by attempting to find a way into the concession. However, our ability to establish new revenue sources would be dubious at best until we acquired more manpower. Our present numbers barely allowed for small hit-and-run missions, and the loss of even a single member would severely impact our organizational efficacy. In order for the Kozuki organization to survive, to say nothing of meeting our objectives, we needed to expand. I didn't think I'd be the best recruiter, considering my obvious mixed heritage and age, but if I encouraged other cell members to find likely candidates and bring them to me, I was sure that the personnel management skills I built up in my past 2 lives would help me sort the wheat from the chaff. In order to recruit beyond the social circles of pre-existing members, and in order to open up potential funding sources like donations from sympathizers, the Kozuki group needed more recognition, or at least notoriety. Our implicit goal was to serve as the red right hand and attack dogs for the Stadtfeld organization, improving the lives of the Japanese by usurping de facto power from the current Britannian administration, a goal that required us to be a feared element that the average Britannian knew existed. After some thought, I considered that the successful insurgencies of my first life have constructive elements as well as destructive tendencies, from religious extremists to fascist militias to dead-end communist groups hiding in jungles and caves. All successful irregular forces offered something beyond the water potential recruits. By contrast, the fools who had tried to take our NA from us had no goal, nothing to offer the people of their city, other than a momentary opportunity to take revenge on an occupying power. I remembered exactly how well that had ended for them. As I began to consider how to deal with the Gordian knot these overlapping issues represented, Ogi finally showed up, dripping with enough rainwater to flatten his pompadour out completely. I desperately wanted to say it was a dramatic improvement, but it just made him look like a drowned man. "Ah, good, you're finally here." Before he'd even closed the door to the studio behind him, I was already up and moving. I didn't own a raincoat, but at least the rain would ideally wash the worst of the filth from my borrowed sweatshirt, and I had found a mostly intact umbrella while scavenging a week ago. Let's get over to the basement. I need to see what we've currently got stocked up, and what we need. Ogi looked unhappy at the prospect of going back out so soon, but after I pointed out that he was already soaked he gave in. Soon, we were heading through the rain-slicked streets of Shinjuku, carefully avoiding the many flooded areas and dodging around potholes. The collapse of any kind of civic infrastructure in Shinjuku beyond impromptu repairs made by whoever cared enough to work had led to the effective destruction of the drain system in the ghetto. Any storm drains that hadn't been destroyed during the combat or collapsed from neglect were jammed with accumulated rubble and trash, and flooded whenever any substantial quantity of rain fell. Worse yet were the old subway tunnels, many of which served as shelter for large numbers of Japanese refugees, particularly those newly forced into Shinjuku from areas annexed into the concession. The broken tunnels were almost constantly wet, and some of the lower areas fully flooded during monsoon season, driving many out into the streets in search of alternative shelter and causing many of those who stuck it out below ground to catch pneumonia. Aside from the harsh winter months, the monsoon period was easily the worst time to be stuck in Shinjuku. I considered this as Ogi and I did our best to avoid the filthier puddles, where the corpses of drowned rats floated and the patinas of oil shimmered. I knew that some combat groups in the world I'd once lived in had conducted urban renewal programs and other civic improvements to buy the love of the local population and to burnish their credentials as the guardians of the common man, and I wondered if we could co-opt that strategy for our own purposes. Organizing whoever was willing to work would give us an excuse to talk to lots of people who were demonstrably interested in improving life in the ghetto, and acquiring construction equipment would give us an excuse to haul large loads of materials around, which could make smuggling operations more practical as well. Further, if we could make contacts in the local construction firms, that could be a source of specialized labor, particularly people who have experience with demolitions and explosives, which might make it easier to produce material for bombs. Plus, we would actually be improving the lives of the people of Shinjuku, which would improve the group's PR and would reflect well on me. I wondered idly if the group had ever considered that sort of public outreach as a recruiting tactic before. I wonder what recruiting tactics they've tried at all, considering how small the organization is. I looked up at the man stoically walking a pace ahead of me, doing his best to ignore the wind blowing the rain into our faces. Naoto said I should speak to Ino and Ogi, and referenced strategy and logistics when outlining potential ways I could assist the group. If Ino is the logistics officer, is Ogi in charge of planning? If so, he'd probably have a handle on recruitment efforts, if only in a supervisory role. Hey, Ogi, I began, raising my voice slightly over the wind and taking a quick look around to see if there was anybody nearby to overhear. Fortunately, the rain had swept the people of Shinjuku from its streets as effortlessly as it had swept the garbage into the clogged gutters, and nobody else was foolish enough to be outside at the moment. Can I ask you a question? Fortunately, Ogi slowed down so I didn't have to try and keep up with him while holding a conversation. He looked miserable, but smiled encouragingly at me. What do you want to know, Tanya? How do we find people? I tried to keep the question as general as possible, just in case the unmaintained streets had ears. Ogi sighed and shivered theatrically. Well, Tanya, that's a pretty broad question, isn't it? He muttered his response, stooping as a particularly strong gust threw the rain at us with a renewed energy. But considering what Naoto said he was going to talk to you about, I'm guessing you mean targets for your next attack, right? Figures that the sadist would immediately jump to the next battle. Honestly, if Ogi was in charge of planning, it was miraculous the group hadn't been mired in constant running battles yet. I was actually thinking about recruiting. I decided to throw caution to the winds and stop beating around the bush. If Ogi was willing to talk about my budding war on the Yakuza in the open air, I could talk about recruitment. Plus, I was getting cold enough that I urgently wanted a distraction from the water running down my spine. What recruitment operations are we currently running? I know you and Naoto go way back, but you can't recruit an army with social connections alone. Ogi grunted non-committally, before sighing again. We're not currently running any recruitment operations, Tanya. What you see is what we've got. No way. Nobody's recruiting for this group at all? But, what happens if someone dies? Or what happens if we need a mission that requires more than 6 people? Why aren't we recruiting? I tried to keep my tone politely professional, but a crack of anger came through on the last sentence. I just couldn't understand why the organization had neglected such a crucial function of any successful enterprise. Ogi winced. Well, Tanya, none of us are professional rebels, you know? This cell just kind of happened. Once Naoto got back from Britannia, he had all kinds of ideas, and enough money and guns to get us started, but... He winced again and swallowed. Well, after we reached out to our old friends and acquaintances we thought would be interested, we didn't really have any idea where to go from there. You can't exactly publicly recruit for an anti-Britannian rebel group, you see? I processed the information I'd gotten from Ogi as we continued to make our way through Shinjuku. I had known the group was green when I'd first joined up, but I hadn't realized how inexperienced they really were. Looking back, I could see lots of things that should have clued me into how new this cell was, including the way Naoto had carelessly revealed sensitive information and explosives in front of me, and how easy it had been to take down Tamaki. I had fundamentally misunderstood a key aspect of my employment, and I was rapidly beginning to suspect that Naoto and Ogi had also misunderstood the same thing I had. I hadn't really been onboarded as an intern or an entry-level employee like I had suspected. Instead, I'd almost been hired on as something of an outside consultant, someone with valuable experience that could be used to improve the core experience of the group, given adequate time, resources, and freedom. I hadn't recognized that, because I was under the impression that the group was more established than it actually was. Naoto hadn't recognized that, because he hadn't expected someone of my physical age to contribute much to the group beyond another body to throw at problems. Thankfully, in light of my recent achievements, Naoto had reconsidered my role and granted me the freedom I needed to really improve my new cell. I had earned sufficient respect from at the very least my supervisor and hopefully the rest of my comrades as well to propose alterations to the strategy of the group. Now I would have to follow up by improving the operations necessary to make those strategies something other than idle dreams. Ino was already waiting for us in the thankfully dry sub-basement. Ogi huddled near the generator, stretching his hands over the chugging machine in the hopes of warming them up just slightly, while I went to the lounge area to join Ino, doing my best to ignore the wet chill of my clothes as I did so. Unfortunately, I couldn't convince her to start talking about the important matters of logistics until she had plopped a Britannian army ration in front of me and acquiesced to her demand that I eat. I considered refusing, seeing how it would be difficult to maintain my professional poise with a mouthful of rehydrated spaghetti, but I remembered Naoto's exhortation to eat more so I would appear Britannian and gave in. The growling of my stomach had no impact on my decision-making process, of course, but the chemically heated food did take the edge off the cold nicely. Naoto told me to tell you everything I can about how the cell's logistics work, so feel free to ask questions. Although, to be honest, there's lots of stuff I'm kind of unclear about myself. Most of our money comes from Naoto, who gets it from his father. Ino had begun to brief me on the supply side of our operations, starting with our revenue sources, of which we had essentially one. I'm not exactly sure how that process works, but Naoto just hands me an envelope of money each month. Aside from that, we get some funding by selling goods we steal from Britannian-owned warehouses and occasionally from the more isolated noble manors. As she went on, Ogi joined me on the couch with his own packaged ration, but kept quiet as Ino continued. Most of these exchanges are cashless. We trade valuables or useful materials for weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, rations, so on and so forth. I nodded. From my experience, most of the local Shinjuku economy was barter-based, and it made sense that the more pedestrian black market trades would follow suit. What does the black market look like? Is it mostly independent sellers with informal connections to groups like yours? Or is it mostly gang representatives? Is there some kind of central venue, or is it more distributed? It's a pretty mixed bag. Ino had begun to smile, and I wondered if she'd been eager for someone to talk shop with. It really depends on what you're selling, and what you're trying to buy. Thanks to the Britannians, she grimaced, as did Ogi. The default response to any mention of our hated conquerors, even stuff you wouldn't think would be on the black market is, since they collect their taxes as often as they send soldiers to patrol here. So, you've got lots of independents selling food, blankets, clothes, light bulbs, hand tools, you name it, and they tend to sell out of their houses, or back rooms or whatever. She made a cutting gesture with one hand, as if setting that demographic aside. Then you've got slightly larger players who trade more specific, valuable items. Lots of them are around our size, less than 10 people, and they tend to be dedicated to a specific type of item. Vehicle parts, medical supplies, medicine, computer parts, burner phones, that sort of thing. Usually valuable, usually portable, and something you'd probably get shot for if the Brits finding you selling it. I nodded understandingly at that. Those were the bread and butter of groups like our own, and it was understandable that the Britannians heavily discouraged their sale to 11s like ourselves. And how do these small, independent operators sell their goods? Well, that depends. Some of them have little hideouts like our basement. Ino gestured at the bare cement walls, particularly the armory shelves. There's a couple of loose groups that have banded together to hold periodic exchanges in a few of the more abandoned subway stations, the ones that are flooded half the year. They usually charge a small fee to enter, and usually apply a tax to sales made in their markets, which go towards bribing the Britannians to stay away from those areas. Oh yeah, those markets pretty much exclusively deal in Brit cash or valuables. That raised an interesting point regarding the corruptibility of the local Britannian garrison. But Ino was on a roll and I didn't want to divert her onto a tangent, so I just signaled for her to keep going. The grey-eyed woman nodded, and continued. Above that, and you're getting into the lower-end gangs, which is about as high as we've ever traded. They control the local weapons trade, and if you want to buy firearms and ammunition here in Shinjuku, you can't escape dealing with the gangs. Same goes for hard drugs, good medicine, explosives, and people. That raised all kinds of questions, starting from can you be more specific about which gangs are involved in what? To people? and I decided to start with the most obvious one. Ino sighed. Yes, people. The Britannians aren't the only slavers around in Shinjuku, I'm afraid. The gangs deal in kidnapping and ransom collection, and they sell people who they aren't paid for quickly enough to whoever wants to buy them, or put them to work in some of the more, extreme entertainment areas catering to Britannians. She winced as she talked about the last bit, and I could understand why. Nobody wanted to talk to a child about human trafficking, after all. That said, Naoto had clearly approached me as an adult capable of making my own choices, and if I backslid now when it would be convenient, he likely would lose faith in my ability to stand on my own 2 feet. One Sogi inevitably reported back to him. Time to nip this in the bud. Ino, my mother was a prostitute. I began, choosing my words with care. I know how she paid our rent and bought our food. I know what a brothel is. I'm fortunate that she cared enough about me to tell me which streets I should avoid at all costs, and the kind of men I should run from. You don't need to censor yourself around me. Now Ino and Ogi both looked uncomfortable, which I regretted, but it had to be done. Tanya. Ino began in a soft voice, I wasn't just talking about prostitution. I don't know if it's still happening, but, well, at least for a few years after the conquest, some of the Britannian nobles would pay to watch dogs sicked on Japanese. Apparently, they'd take bets on how many minutes it would take before the dogs would tear out their throats. She trailed off, and Ogi chimed in with a caveat, at least according to the rumors. Well, that was interesting, in a way. It's utterly disgusting. It's a waste of human resources and displays a contempt for our common humanity. I supposed it wasn't too much of a stretch from the infamous Colosseum games of the Romans, but the idea of being savaged by dogs before a crowd of watching Britannian nobles. I didn't need a new reason to hate the Britannians, and I didn't want to get overly emotional. I was here to do a job, and I could rage at the utter depravity of the barbarians who had conquered us later. Tell me more about the gangs. Do different gangs specialize in different goods? Do they have any sort of united governing organization, or do they compete against each other? Ino shook herself, and continued, her voice returning to its previous, confident timbre. The gangs are in no way united. They frequently go to war with each other, usually over territory, but sometimes over the right to sell at different markets. She took a breath, and continued in a lecturing tone. I wondered if Ogi was the only former teacher in our ranks. Basically, there are a few pieces of common ground throughout Shinjuku where weekly meets are held. They're pay to enter, but they tend to be pretty safe, since nobody wants business disrupted. The gangs tend to work out who will get to sell what or where either by negotiating or fighting during the week before the market. Ogi looked up from his ration again. They're usually a pretty well-attended affair. Lots of Japanese, but lots of Britannians there too, soldiers and nobles usually, but you get a few corporate types every now and again. Which led neatly into another useful discussion topic. How corrupt are the Britannians here? I asked. Clearly there's some on the take, but how do you know which ones won't just shoot you and take the cash? Ino nodded briskly. Great question. That's always a risk, especially as you go higher up in the food chain. She began tapping on the table, presumably burning of stress as she continued. If you can, approach soldiers from the homeland, not the other areas. They're more confident in their supremacy, so they'll take the bribes as their due and leave you alone. The ones drawn from other number populations feel the need to prove their loyalty, so they're less willing to take a bribe, or pricier if they do. Approach the common Britannian soldiers, and be prepared to spend a great deal. A simple rule. Makes sense. Anything else? Check their uniforms. Ogi had finished his food, and leaned into the discussion. Their bodies and posture too. If their uniforms look shabby, or if they're overweight or slouching, they're probably not worried about looking good or working hard. They're usually the ones willing to take a bit to look the other way. That seemed like a decidedly risky assumption to make, and I took it with a grain of salt, remembering that the cell was almost as new to all this as I was. But they're still alive and free, so they might be onto something. It did mesh with what I remembered from my time in the Imperial Army. Most of the time, the more slovenly a soldier was, the less concerned with they were. On the other hand, if they had just signed up for the opportunity to kill with impunity, they'd be equally unconcerned with the niceties of military life and perfectly willing to murder. After that, The meeting gradually wound down, until Ino announced she had to get home to make dinner for her aged parents. I thanked her for her time, and reassured her that Ogi and I would shut down the generator and lock up before we left. I took the opportunity to convince Ogi to join me for a bit of target practice, and spent the next hour improving his accuracy with great results. He seemed somewhat bemused at being instructed by a biological child, inverting the relationship he was accustomed to, but to his credit he dutifully corrected his grip when prompted and stopped jerking the pistol up when he pulled the trigger. After another wet walk back home, I found myself back under my blanket with a mind brimming with ideas. It was clear that the gangs had to go, but if they had that much traffic with Britannians, someone would have to at least temporarily step into the market gap to prevent the Britannians from doing so themselves. Except for the human trafficking market segment, which would have to be torn out root and branch. On the plus side, freed slaves have always been an excellent source of rebellious fighters with nothing to lose.